Welcome to the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transportation, North America, CILTNA. My name is Bob Sacco, and I'm the CILTNA chair. Thank you for attending our panel discussion on Trump tariffs and CUSMA. We're pleased to have speakers with deep strategic and hands-on experience in these matters. Their bios have been submitted in advance and is online. Due to some scheduling changes, we've moved this webinar from tomorrow at noon to today. This session will be taped to allow those that could not make today's session or our friends in the West Coast because of time zone differences, the ability to access the recording. There have been some questions submitted in advance that will help guide today's discussions. There's also a chat feature for online questions, and some questions will be selected and presented to the speakers. Any questions asked in the chat but not answered due to time restraints will be followed up separately by email. In a moment, I will introduce Joy Nott, today's moderator. Joy is a member of our board for GTA and Halton Hamilton for CILTNA, and a past CEO executive of IE Canada, and now currently a trade and customs partner at KPMG. I'll also ask that each speaker state their name, title, and role in regards to the customs and trade environment before answering any questions. So CILTNA is among the preeminent North American forums for logistics and transportation thought leadership, debate, mature education, academic partnership, and advanced career development. Our members and stakeholder groups will be diverse across all dimensions and will include students and professionals and practitioners at all levels, from shippers, carriers, logistics and transportation service providers, passenger service providers, infrastructure owners and operators, governments of all levels, and academia. CILTNA's parent body, the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transportation, is recognized globally as one of the industry's leading professional associations, with headquarters in London, UK, and over 30,000 members worldwide. It was founded in 1919 and awarded a royal charter by King George V in 1926. Over to you, Joy.
Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you to Tim, Webb, and Flavio for joining us today. I'm going to kick it off by asking a really broad question, Flavio, and I'm going to throw it over to you first. So tariffs, we're exactly 1 week away from April 2nd today. So are tariffs the end game, or is this the beginning?
Well, game is the operative word here. We've got, in automotive, just by my count, we've got 5 layers of tariffs that the Americans have threatened on us, and they've also said, the administrators also said, well, they would apply, they would stack. Also said, there'd be no drawbacks. They are the tool that the president is using to do 2 things: destabilize trading relationships that have been formed since the end of World War II, and in some cases like ours, forever. Ours centered around 60 years of tariff-free sale of cars and parts in the Auto Pact. And then also, I think he's deliberately, and they're deliberately trying to challenge or break every industrial convention in the United States itself. It bears repeating many times that tariffs are paid by the consumer, by the importer.
Yeah. And
tariffs on Canadian goods or Mexican goods or European or Japanese goods are going to be paid by Americans. It isn't, if we take them by themselves, there's no point in them. So they can't be the end game. The end game is a restructuring of the balance between these regions, inside this region, and also a checking of the balance of industrial power and influence in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Flavio. I think that in this particular administration, tariffs are seen as a major policy tool, and it doesn't really matter if it's just trade. If you step back from trade, I think that tariffs is often a solution to no matter what the problem is. For example, on the northern border, the executive order was illegal immigration and fentanyl, which I think we can all agree as Canadians, not to say that there's none of that happening, but the numbers just don't substantiate a national emergency. So, whatever the problem is, tariffs seems to be the answer. And like you, I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. But I mean, Tim, we've certainly seen the reaction to what Flavio was just saying in Canada being this buy Canadian sentiment. And I mean, companies are going to potentially make snap decisions to pivot away from US suppliers, for example, and try to find a Canadian supplier instead. All of that's great sentiment, but from a supply chain perspective, like, what are your thoughts around people making snap decisions and revectoring and pivoting their supply chains?
Yeah, Joe, that's good. A really good question, because we have seen clients move very quickly. Simple things where you're moving inventory across the border to try and avoid tariffs before they hit. Those are things that are relatively short term and aren't going to have particularly long-term impacts unless you have obviously moved inventory and now are starving one of your other clients, potentially a European client, as an example. But if you start making supplier changes, these are much more long-term and could potentially have significantly higher reputational damage. So we have absolutely come across clients that have moved suppliers and start running into cyber risks, start running into child labor and ESG issues, just because the due diligence didn't take time. So the administration, the U.S. administration, is making announcements every day, and it's always fluid. But I think I think over the last month we've kind of realized that it's not necessarily tomorrow that this is going to come in. So we do need to, as organizations, not sit back and do nothing. But certainly think deeply and act responsibly. But the word I want to underline there is we need to act through planning and understand where we need to go next, understand our obligations. Don't just sit back and hope that if we put our head in the sand, everything's going to be okay next month. Because to Flavio's point, there's an end game here. There's going to be more after this. Tariffs are step number one. We're moving into a globalization 2.0, if we want to coin that phrase. There's going to be a new global trade regime emerging over the next few years, and we need to be ready for that.
I agree with you, and I don't personally have a fully formed image in my head as to what globalization 2.0 looks like, because traditionally the United States has been at the center of all of the infrastructure that's been in place since the end of World War II. I mean, the WTO and you just look at anything when you look at trade, the United States has always been sort of in the center and everything else revolves around it. So if that paradigm is going to shift, Flavio, do you have any thoughts on what globalization 2.0 could look like? What do you think what could this look like, let's say, after this administration is gone?
It's a good question. I'll tell you the one thing that, in the context here, that the shift is also happening at an incredibly quick pace.
Yeah.
Normally, a traditionally disruptive government, in Washington, D.C. or elsewhere, would go through a process where you would signal all the big disruptions you want to do, and then go through a process that includes consultation. And some of the legislation that they're using to justify some of this action, Trade Expansion Act 1974, International Economic Emergency Powers Act, have either a pre-consultation and a public period, or they require the White House to come back to Congress for after the initial emergency act. Well, we've done this all in 50 days. And none of the business leaders or country leaders around the world who are either allies or adversaries have modeled for the President of the United States being the chief disruptor of the American economy and American alliances and American leverage. On the leverage pieces, we see them giving up leverage in exchange for focusing in places. So giving up leverage means abandoning these international organizations that they've essentially led since the end of World War II. Sure, the Chinese have risen in influence, UN, WTO, all these places, but they're just giving it up in exchange for making alliances with players who none of us have invested in, have been previously sanctioned heavily by American administrations, who are resource rich, who may end up being competitors of ours in a period that you snap your fingers and it happened. What does globalization 2.0 look like? I don't know. Look, from a Canadian perspective, similar values, and I'm not talking about political values, although I guess in principally, contextually, yes, but in how we view return on investment and what we're willing to trade for it. The Europeans are important. The Japanese, the Koreans are important. The Australians are important. But I'll remind everybody that in some businesses, like in the goods businesses, especially big goods, expensive goods with low return expectations, you can't trade across oceans. And so that's limited. Is there a bigger focus on a service trade? Does service trade end up leading globalization 2.0? Probably. And then are we going back to kind of the mercantile system of the 19th century, or do you become a superpower or a power of consequence in this new world if you've got resources that can be extracted and lent against and sold to former adversaries? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Joy, there's got to be smarter people. They're probably watching us today that could answer that.
Well, there's two things that you said that sort of made me, things popped into my head. I'll start with the second one first. When you talk about potentially could globalization 2.0 look back to like the mercantile era, the current president in the United States has said a number of times that he believes that America was at its richest between 1870 and 1913. And if you think that's an odd, 1870, 1913, what is that? If you look back in history at that point in time, at least for part of it, the president was McKinley. Tariffs were in place. There was no income tax act. And if you looked at American society, you had the very, very wealthy, and that you had the Astors and the Vanderbilts and, the JP Morgan and all these uber wealthy people. And then you had the masses who existed, but there was really no middle class. You had the wealthy, and then you had everybody else, and there was nothing in between. And I think to some regard that I think it's realistic in my view to believe that this administration is looking at doing massive income tax cuts and replacing the revenue with tariffs to go back to that sort of mercantile kind of 2 centuries ago kind of market that is seen by this president as being at the time when America was at its richest, which I think others would argue that post-World War II, post-World War II, the Americans had developed the largest economy in the world, put a man on the moon, and I could keep going. Post-World War II, in my view, is when America was at its strongest, but unfortunately, that's not the thinking now. And then the other thing that you said that sort of twigged in my mind, you were talking about leverage and how they're giving up leverage right now and doing things like withdrawing from World Health Organization and withdrawing from some of these global entities that they helped to create pre and post World War II. In some ways, I wonder if it's not so much giving up leverage, but pivoting their leverage, because right now, what they seem to be leveraging is the fact that they have the world's largest economy. So they're using that like a hammer, right? You want access to the world's largest economy? That's the leverage we're going to use. We don't need to be part of these rules-oriented, organizations, because to the point that you're making, we've done all of this change in 50 days. And that's kind of like the, think about when Twitter was taken over in a very quick order, right? Very quick order, within days. People were let go, and the entire thing was repivoted. There's this attitude of go in, break it fast, and then rebuild it from the ground up in whatever image you want it to be if you're the leader. So I think that from a leveraging standpoint, they've just pivoted, I should say. They've pivoted away from a rules-based leveraging, which can kind of cramp their style, to a no rules-based and just using their might, their economic might, as the leverage point.
Yeah, let me just say, give you an additional thought to that. Using the world's biggest economy and really for companies that are selling goods and services, the biggest consumer market with the highest disposable income per capita, in a consumerism culture. And so that's a powerful carrot. Except what we're starting to get in here in conversations, at least in our industry, is, well, if they're also willing to do away with inconveniences like predictable contracts and the rule of law, predictable agreements and market access, and rule by fiat or whim, and then introduce universal tariffs that eat that disposable income, and also do things that, at least in the automotive business, for example, Canada is a cog inside the North American machine, and so is Mexico. If you put tariffs, it would be like throwing sand in that machine. You'll break that machine. And if you're going to cause for instability in the labor market, you're going to cause for a pressure an upward pressure in the cost of money. Well, then that market isn't the oasis that you think it is. And we'll see announcements like the one that Hyundai made yesterday or on Monday with the White House. Look, my instinct on a lot of these things is that everybody's trying to find a way to take the target off their back. And so they take their 5-year and 10-year capital plans. They bias those on the US, and they go and present them like you're making an offering. But all of those are conditional. They're conditional, like the Foxconn announcement of $10 billion in Trump's first administration. It's conditional on the market being able to pull those investments over a hurdle rate. And his haste, if I have a fiduciary obligation to a massive balance sheet of a healthy company, I'm not running full speed into, well, let me put something down in the US. You might be running full speed into, like, hold on a second. Let me see what the next 50 days looks like, or the next 200 days looks like. Let me see about whether tariff threats become tariffs or tariff exemptions. They are, if they are able to run full speed without any barrier, without any checks and balances, they will break that US market that is the carrot. And we'll all be left with nothing. It doesn't benefit us. It doesn't mean it's going to come here. We do not have a pull market that can compete. It's just a mess for everybody.
Yeah, Flavio, I think that is what a lot of clients are talking about right now. It's like, let me understand, how much risk am I at? That's the constant question. Joy, we were chatting about it earlier today. Yeah, our recommendation is, yes, we don't know what the future is, but we can plan. And that's about scenario planning, understanding on this. You make a really good point around, the automotive industry. You lose too much margin by moving product internationally in many cases. But we are in a world now where we've got to take a look at ourselves and say we don't no longer have a competitive advantage simply because we share a border with the largest market. We've got to consider other options. And when we talk about, there's two pieces. There's obviously this international expansion that we can talk about, and we can move, to new markets. But there also is, a productivity gap that we have allowed to grow in Canada over the last couple of decades. And this should be that opportunity now, as you say, in an automotive industry where we need to stay close physically. Are there areas in our supply chain that we can really go and relook at, rethink, go from first principles and really get targeted at becoming the most efficient? Can we get ourselves to that top productivity position again? That's really where I see this as an opportunity for our industries to focus.
I would agree, Tim. And there was a great article, I think it was on Monday of this week in the Financial Times, talking about how Canada could be a superpower. But because if you look around, we are blessed with a lot of assets, meaning not only the minerals we have in the ground, but our location on Earth, the fact that we have such a large patch of land in such a small population, we have a lot of opportunity to build and grow. And we just, to the point you were just making, our productivity levels have been down. And I think in large part because we have been situated next to the United States and because that was just an easy market to access, we didn't really need to think about being global. We were next door to the biggest market in the world. Why think global when right next door you've got, the biggest market you can have? So we're not as diversified as we might otherwise be. But I mean, when you're talking to companies about looking at their supply chains, and that I agree with you, the question that I get asked the most often is, what do I think is going to happen? And the companies are looking for certainty. They're looking to grab onto anything that they can that will give them what they feel to be basic building blocks so that they can start to make decisions. And I think back to COVID, Tim, and during COVID, there was also a lot of unknown and there was supply chain disruption. How is this different than what happened during COVID?
It's in many cases it's not. I think in COVID the supply chain executive was suddenly catapulted into the C-suite, and maybe we've forgotten a little bit about that. If we take a look at what supply chain does, we work in uncertainty. If you take a look at what drives the supply chain is a forecast, and we're very proud of ourselves if we get an 85% forecast correct. We typically are sitting at 55 to 65% because we're asking humans to buy our products. So supply chain executives by definition work in a world of uncertainty. So we really should be focusing on how do we get those tool sets that they use for decision making, and what I'm talking about there is operational research students out of university. We have incredible students that can come out of university and help us with operational research programs to help us drive costs down. We should be looking at scenario planning tools to be able to say, well, what's in the future? What do we think could happen? And how's that going to impact me? So that I can start to configure, and I'm using the word configure and not change specifically, so I can configure my supply chain so that it can be more reactive when we know. To be able to sit around and go, okay, it's now decided. We said this earlier, okay, it's now decided, tariffs are decided. Well, there's going to be a step number 2. There's at least another 10 steps that the administration is going to do to fundamentally change what's happening in the US. So we have to be able to be on our toes, and to do that, we need to use the data in our supply chains. We need to get comfortable with uncertainty. The only way you can get comfortable with uncertainty is to start doing scenario planning so that your leadership team can potentially look around the corner and kind of understand what's going to happen. And as those certainties play out, your model becomes clearer and clearer, and you're able to react as soon as you are in a position to, and then change supply chain rather than just configure. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. And I mean, another question that I get asked, well, I shouldn't say that I get asked, a question that I'm asking of clients often is, when you look at your supply chain and you look at these tariffs, who in the chain do you envision absorbing the tariffs? Because somebody somewhere has to pay the piper at the end of the day. So for some clients, I hear very clear, it has to be us. Cannot pass this on to the client. I will lose my client base. It has to be us that absorbs it. In some cases, I hear, I'll negotiate and maybe we'll split it 50-50. And in some cases, I've heard very clearly, we have to pass it on to the client, because if I don't pass it on to the client, I've got months to live.
Yeah, we did a study, I think it was released 3 weeks ago, I'd say, and if I remember the number exactly, I think it was 68% in total. It was close to 70% of companies surveyed, company leaders. There was about 600 company leaders, small, medium, and large enterprises, feel that they could weather a tariff war of around about the 25% mark for about a year.
Yeah.
There would need to be some tightening of belts, and we would probably see some uncomfortable situations. But that certainly seemed to be was the outcome of that survey. That we do feel confident that 12 months is we can handle that. And if we think back to the steel and aluminum tariffs from previously, those were in place for 12 months as well, give or take. Flavio, correct me if I'm wrong. You would have been much closer to that than I was at the time. So it's about getting through. I think a lot of people are taking a look and saying, can we get through those 12 months? And hopefully by then we have a policy, Flavio and the team and the wider Canadian leadership are able to actually negotiate those things off. But again, is it just tariffs? So
yeah, and you actually brought up a good point. I mean, in 2018, 2019, another thing that I find myself explaining a lot, and Flavio, you probably are in the same situation to some extent. We had aluminum and steel tariffs in 2018, 2019, and lo and behold, they're back. But this time, they're different than they were last time. They're a little bit more expansive. We've got derivatives on the table, and derivatives are things made of iron and steel and aluminum. I mean, Flavio, how is this different now this time? I mean, aside from the obvious, now it's a wider gunshot kind of spray of tariffs across everything, but the steel and aluminum impacted the automotive industry negatively in 2018, 2019. What's happening now with those tariffs? Is that going to have the same impact? Because I think if you ask the typical Canadian, 2018, 2019, they didn't really see anything change. Life didn't really change. There was belt tightening maybe at some automotive and other industry sectors that use steel and aluminum, but life went on uninterrupted. How is this different this time?
Yeah, good question. And Joy, you and I spent a lot of time in that 2018, 2019, just trying to kind of chew through the regs and the process. And you're right. This time we're talking about derivative products. But to my first comment in this webinar, which is they're moving at a speed where they are skipping past the usual processes of proposing regs and proposing language, then getting industry feedback. They've put derivative products in, but they didn't consult with anybody. And so suppliers in our business are trying to get a determination from Customs and Border Patrol on whether that frame in the seat that I'm sitting in is a derivative steel product in the seat that I'm shipping, hoping that the answer is no. But there is no clarity, and that lack of clarity is costly, both in terms of confidence in your risk profile, but also if it changes based on a determination on a specific day by CBP official responsible for that, you can't really plan out what that means. These seats, if you're in London, Ontario, and you're supplying seats to the Toledo, Ohio Jeep plant, they're buying 5,000 seats a day. That's a lot. And then what's the value of the application of a steel and aluminum tariff inside that complex seat assembly? Is it the proportional cost of steel? Has there already been a duty paid on that steel that offsets it? Well, there's no duty drawbacks.
Yeah.
And who do you go to? The big difference between 2018 and 2019 is while they were very much trade hawks at the time, there was a traditional Republican group in the executive that from time to time would say, well, again, I get where we're going. Let's pump the brakes for a moment. How does this affect Lear, a U.S. seat company with 50% of the market and in all three countries? This time they said, well, I don't even want to hear about the seat. Never mind Lear. Just do it. And if you don't do it, I'm going to get somebody else to do it. And not to be flippant, but this is the same group of people that accidentally texted war plans to a journalist. So there isn't a message discipline, there isn't the execution discipline, and it is a similar ethic throughout these first 50 days in all departments. And in our business, what department's important? USTR, CBP, Commerce, Treasury, Homeland Security. I guess we're checking for fentanyl inside those seats.
Mhm.
And it sounds like I'm being funny, but in each one of those buckets is a tariff. And somewhere in all of those buckets is some steel. And there's no answer.
Yeah.
That's the no answer part. They're not looking for one. They understand that when there's no answer, there's an investment freeze, especially the investment freeze outside of the US. And so it may be for us, it looks accidental. It may be just for them that's their MO, and they'll keep playing with the yo-yo as long as it'll keep bouncing.
So, I mean, you just talked about an investment freeze. I mean, I've heard you say a number of times now in the media that if the universal tariffs, the APMA tariffs, were to hit, and 25% across the board against all tariffs, and then stack on top of it the steel and aluminum and the derivatives, what you just finished explaining, you said that it would probably take the industry like 5 to 10 days, something like that, to shut down. Is that because of an investment freeze, or is it literally just because supply chains would become clogged up? Because you say that, but what's behind that statement?
Sure. So look, in the end, the importer of record's got to pay the surtax. Typically in automotive, the importer of record is the OE, although there are some exceptions. And for 60 years, being the importer of record did not have as its responsibility to pay tariffs on parts that originate in Canada. So let's take those same seats. That might be $100 million order by that G plant. So is Stellantis going to pay that $25 million extra for the seats? And the $1 billion extra on the $4 billion worth of components that plant buys from Canada and Mexico? If it does, that's a $10 billion enterprise a year. Okay, they make 250,000, $40,000 cars a year. They do that at 6.5% return on investment. That 25% tariff on 40% of their goods is a 10% hit. How many assembly days and weeks are you going to schedule when you know you're losing money on every single one of them?
Yeah.
And what's the hit per vehicle? When you start saying that the hit per vehicle is 2,000, it's 3,000, in some cases 6,000, 9,000, and you make 1,000 cars a day in a typical assembly plant. How many $4, $5, $6 million loss days are you going to book before you say, hold on a second, the supplier's got to take that hit? Now you're that supplier, and it's $100 million worth of seats, and you're making 7%. So your bill of materials is 93 million, and Stellantis says 25 million comes to you. How many production days are you going to schedule for those seats? Now we as an industry shut down anyway in the summer. Typically, the assembly plants will shut down for MRO or scheduled 5, 6, 7 weeks. We know how to shut down. We shut down on March 18th, 2020, when the day after then President Trump said, oh, we do have a pandemic. And then you can't guarantee that you're going to have a workforce tomorrow. I'm like, let's control that shutdown. That was 60 days. In February 2022, a bunch of people blocked the Ambassador Bridge for a bunch of days. Within 2 days, we started to see that domino effect happen, and the industry shut down from Ontario to Kentucky. It's the same dynamic. On that one, APMA went to court. You hear my friend, the mayor of Windsor, and the Attorney General of Ontario say that they went to court. They were interveners on our request to get an emergency injunction to enforce the law. That's an important precedent. I think what we're going to see happen, and by the way, now S&P Global agrees with me. The industry will shut down probably within a week, and then American interests withstanding will go to court and say, I want to challenge the use of IEPA to put tariffs on those seats and turn my Jeeps into an unprofitable venture because of some national emergency threat that none of us can figure out. And APMA, I represent companies with 170 plants in the US with 26 states and 47,500 employees. We'll go to court. We'll try. Everybody's going to have to try something other than to book a loss on everything they make at a level, like if you're at 25% tariff and you're making minivans in Windsor and selling them to families in St. Louis, that's 4.5 times your profit margin burned because somebody who's trying to make a point nobody can understand. You're not going to keep the plant running. I guarantee you. And
Or you're going to push the price up of the product.
Exactly. That's what I was
No.
going to say. If the plant did keep running, and those costs that you're talking about needed to be absorbed, that $4 billion worth of goods, $1 billion worth of cost now needs to be absorbed. The price of those vehicles on the lot would just, it's got to go somewhere. Those costs have to go somewhere. They're going to push through to the final product.
Well, automakers have about 90 days worth of product sitting with dealers now, already transferred, sitting with dealers. That's the running inventory. Of course, some are at 70 days, and then some products like Dodge Hornet, they're at 400 days. So you sit there and you say, you're sitting on that much inventory, which, by the way, is about 20 days more than the natural level. This is the softening of demand right now. Are you gonna, if you can't sell a Jeep at 40,000, are you gonna be able to sell that Jeep at 48,000?
No.
So I mean, these are very quick decisions. You sit there and say, am I going to make 1,000 of them today? Which dealer is going to take them? Those dealers are independent businesses. If they take that, they book the loss. And if they can't move the product, they'll push back. They're 25% might as well be 1,000%. You've passed a critical hurdle rate, 25% ago. And the industry does have leverage. And forget the Canadian industry. Detroit, there's 950,000 people in the US who go to work every day to make parts or cars or tools. If they're at home, and that's the threat, the reality of that, that's difficult to manage politically. Joy, you said, they absorbed steel and aluminum tariffs. They did. There really wasn't even a speed wobble. Hard to absorb a price adjustment when you're at home without a job for an undefined period of time. I believe 100% that's why they pulled back on March 5th from the edge after 2 days of costing the industry $75 million a day, at least from Canada to the US, $75 million a day of surtax that I still don't know what the point was.
We've got a question here from the audience where, Tim, I'm gonna throw this one over to you first and then over to Flavio. So this person said, Trump will do as Trump does. What do you do to prepare for 4 years from now when the damage is done and the next president is in place? So, I mean, Tim, I think you were speaking earlier about, what's the word that you used? Not changing the supply chain, that you were calibrating?
Configuring. There's, as you say, we're 50 days in. I think there's midterms in what, 2 years. I think there's quite a bit still to go to find out if this regime is going to stick. We do have JD Vance has clearly set himself up to potentially roll in afterwards, and that could be another 8 years. So, is it 4 years? Is it 12 years? So I think I think we need to recognize that there's going to be fundamental changes. And if we take a look back at when the Biden administration came back in, they didn't unravel everything. there's going to be some things that stick. If we take a look at the underlying, what's, some of the things that are trying to do, hey, let's reduce federal spending. Yes, we all want to reduce federal spending. Do we want to do it in the way that it's happening? No, maybe not. But so some of these things are going to absolutely stick. So we need to be able to configure now, put your scenario planning in place, use your data so that so that you can be agile and move over time. I think we've moved into a world where we don't see a single power anymore, or even a two powers, as we've seen this multipolar world that has been coined by some economists. We're going to see that in the shifting of globalization 2.0 becoming nationalism is going to be coming back very strong, and that's not going to be something that's just here for a year. So we should be preparing to understand that we are always going to be having disruptions throughout our now careers, for the rest of our careers, and those leaders coming that are coming up at the moment. Disruption is going to be the norm. When you remember after COVID, we all thought COVID was done, we could move on, and then the Suez Canal was shut down. So, yeah, and I think that with all the audience on particularly the CILTNA audience on, you need to start considering, like, trucking lanes and transport lanes are going to change. Logistic lanes are going to move. So how do you start to understand what you can do and what you're capable of? What are your core skills and how are you able to apply those into different areas? We've got to become more agile, because it's not just 4 years. It's highly unlikely it's going to be just 4 years.
Yeah, I agree with that. And you were talking earlier during COVID how supply chain professionals were catapulted into the C-suite and, put under the spotlight, and suddenly they were, got more attention probably than they had ever gotten it before in their careers. And that's what's happening right now with customs professionals because of the tariffs. They're being jettisoned into the C-suite. And one of the things that I find most interesting is that, we talk about data a lot. And when you start talking about tariffs specifically in international trade, the data that is probably the most important data sits outside of companies. It sits with customs authorities and it sits with customs brokers. So many times when I talk to clients about data, they don't have the infrastructure to actually take that data and manipulate that data. Not to do a plug, but I'm going to do a plug. Like KPMG actually created a tool for exactly that reason, because this is data that sits outside of companies' ERP systems. Yet right now, in this moment that we live in, it's critical to understand the messages that data can give you if you dissect it and analyze it properly and really dig in. I think there's a lot of value in it. And I know for a lot of companies, they're seeing their company through that lens for the first time, and it's quite revealing. A question has come up here though, Flavio, for you. I'm just scrolling. It basically said the UAW in the United States is pro-tariffs. And what are your thoughts on that? I'm trying to scroll back to it to read it exactly. Is that true that the UAW in the United States is pro-tariff?
It's very interesting. It's not the first time I've been asked this, and it's Joe Biden campaigned on the picket lines with the UAW last year, which is unprecedented. It also helped to poison that relationship with the Trump and the team around Trump. And Sean Fain, who's the current president of the UAW, really combative style. Interviews that he did during collective bargaining sounded more like professional wrestling interviews. The president, who I guess was just a nominee at the time, said the UAW should fire the president, their president, and replace him with me. And then Trump won. And Sean Fain wrote a piece in the Detroit Free Press, I think it was an op-ed piece, and he said, tariffs are good. Now, of course, it was a little bit more nuanced than please tariff Canada and Mexico, but it was, we're trying to protect American auto workers. We will work with the White House. Tariffs like the ones on China are good. But that nuance, first of all, I think it was a convenient nuance. Second of all, I think it was trying to belie the fact that he was trying to cozy up to an administration that he put himself directly opposed to. It's not helpful. And it is the exact opposite position of Unifor, who represents all of the assembly auto workers at the D3 here, and about 20% of the auto parts workers, about 40,000. So they've got obviously a bit of a leverage and equity, and we work very closely with them. It's also at odds with the United Steelworkers Union, who I think is a stronger union. Sorry, has more leverage in the United States than the UAW, or at the very least comparable. I think it's an anecdote that's indicative of the mess that we're in. And where you think traditional allies, and I'm talking about domestically, allies of the industry, allies of ancillary industries that rely on the movement of goods to be healthy and predictable. I certainly wouldn't have predicted that Sean Fain would have been writing an op-ed piece to say Donald Trump is smart. And I keep counseling our members that there is a list that hasn't revealed itself yet of people that will disappoint you in this process. Just like the Americans are eschewing international allies in this attempt to realign industrial dynamics in the U.S., allies within the U.S. that you've counted on, you should check on them because you will be surprised. Another surprise is the CEO, interim CEO and the chair of Stellantis, John Elkann, who is heir to the Agnelli legacy with Fiat. They got rid of Carlos Tavares, their CEO, and are in a CEO search. And he made positive comments about tariffs in the U.S. Now, how is that possible for a company that at least their American brands, Jeep, Ram, Dodge, Chrysler, are very dependent on the established post Canada-U.S. Auto Pact method in North America? Well, my read is they don't want to be a target, and I think the new CEO might be given the task of seeing if they can find buyers for the different divisions. The synergies that put Peugeot, Citroën, and Fiat Chrysler together, have been affected by the rise of the Chinese and lots of other things, the pandemic and everything else. But they may be on another path, and so I think that was another surprise. I will not be surprised to be surprised. And the only antidote to any of this is, like you said, Joy, data. Like you got to be really strong on, okay, well, what's the effect of you guys aligning with that on American industries, American workers, and American revenue? And if you have a good argument, then don't worry that they won't receive you. Put the numbers in the ether. At some point, like, the pendulum will stop swinging, and then there will be a role for math and science. Hopefully it's not too late. And also I don't have rose-colored glasses on this. Like Tim said, the order has changed. And even if J.D. Vance doesn't succeed Donald Trump, once you change these alliances and challenge players around the world to look in different directions, the Americans won't have the equity to bring it back to another place. We will have to just continue with that momentum, and you're trying to mitigate that. I'm old enough now to say it's not going to normalize for as long as I'm working. And what's the new normal? What will emerge? I don't know. I think maybe my kids will figure that out.
And I agree with you. I think that this is what's going to happen after this administration. There'll be permanent changes that I don't know what it's going to look like exactly. But another question from the audience here was like, CETA is not ratified. So what choices do Canadians have? And I mean, I've said this a million times, and I'm going to say it again here. Canada has 15 free trade agreements with 51 countries, covering 60% of the world's GDP. And CETA is partially ratified. It's not ratified with all countries, but there are countries in the EU, and including we have a continuation free trade agreement with the UK. So Canada does have free trade agreements with Europe. Maybe not everywhere, but Canada does have choices. And traditionally, like I was saying earlier, we haven't been the best as a country of really taking advantage of all those choices that we have, because we were physically next door to the United States, and it was just such an easy local market. It was just easy to stick to the United States and to not diversify. But Tim, we talk about data, and I'm dealing right now with a lot of clients and dealing with their data and helping them to have new insights about their business from a trade angle that they've never looked at before. When companies actually start the process of looking for new markets, whether that's looking for new customers or looking for new suppliers, what's amongst the first steps that they should be taking?
I think that probably the first one, especially when you're looking for I'll start with new markets. The first thing that you need is cash, and that's we talk about data, but at the end of the day, if you want to expand, you need cash, and where do you get cash? Is you've got to find savings. So we really should be looking at a double, a two-pronged approach. How do we find savings in our operations so that we can redirect that cash into expansion opportunities? Then there really are, three major ways that you can expand. Is you can obviously acquire a firm over, you can expand yourself organically, or you can set up a JV. We've got a lot of high quality products here in Canada, and there's a subset of those products that we absolutely should be looking at and can compete and bring those into the EU as an example that you made. So really taking a look at those are incredibly important, but it does come down to cash. So don't sit back, because this is what I would like to say to all of the clients that we work with is don't just sit back and say, oh, well, my bank's maybe not going to lend me all this. So we know there's a productivity gap. Go get there, get it fixed, take that cash, put it into expansions. On the other side of the supply chain, what are the first steps to changing suppliers? Well, you want to change suppliers if you are absolutely impacted by moving into the US. So Joy, that does come back to understanding what you and your team do first. Do I need to move a supplier if I'm not going to be impacted by this tariff moving into the US is a first question. So that is step number one. Step number two then is don't rush it. Take the time to do the proper due diligence. Find those. You need to understand your supplier as well. We talk about at the end supplier. I worked with one of the telcos here, and they had bought multiple routers from different suppliers, thought that they were completely diversified and they thought it was all great, until somebody eventually figured out that one of the very obscure chips on the boards happened to be supplied. All of them came out of the same factory in Vietnam. So you think you're diversified, but you're actually not. So you've got to think not just about supply, you've got to think about geopolitical. Should I have a supply out of Vietnam, one out of Taiwan? And those are the kind of things that you need to play through. And scenario planning is most important there as well. You've got to think about your business and understand what the key impacts are to your specific business, because they are different, and how are you going to mitigate those up front? And then how are you going to, in advance of something happening? And then once something happens, like a tariff hit comes in, or your demand is significantly reduced in the US, you then need to take a look at what do I do to recover from that. So those are the kind of the things we look at. But I always come back to whatever we do is we're going to need cash. And I don't think lending it right now is necessarily your number one place to go and get that cash. You need to go and get it out of your own operations.
Yeah, and I just want to throw out there as well that the Canadian government has put some programs together through EDC BDC for companies to take advantage of. So if anybody has any questions on that, reach out to CILTNA, and we'll certainly get you that information if your company's interested. A couple of questions have come up here about CUSMA, and we've got about 5 minutes left. So Flavio, I just want to toss it over to you, and with the question of, is CUSMA dead?
Maybe. Maybe. Look, we've got in auto, I'm counting 5 different tariff threat levels, including the assertion that the CUSMA tariff level is a number. It's 0. It's not that there are none.
Yeah.
It's at a level that's 0. I mean, look, for us, we've always said there's none. I never thought of it as 0. That could be dialed up to 5 or 7. In an agreement, our assumptions, especially over the last 60 years of various levels of agreement in this space, is that it is the preeminent principle and guide for Canada-U.S. relations. If the president is going to use emergency powers, different ones, national security or economic emergency powers, then how can you trust the stability of the CUSMA? And unless they take all of these threats and allow us to deal with them at the CUSMA review table, then very difficult to turn around and say, like if we wanted to pull out of the CUSMA at the 6-year mark as designed, the CUSMA agreement keeps all countries at the table for the next 10 years with an annual review. Well, if there's an auto-specific tariff, for example, that's based on national security, a flimsy national security argument that doesn't get successfully challenged in the U.S. court, then the CUSMA is not worth the paper it's written on.
Do you think that there's an opportunity potentially for 2 bilateral free trade agreements, like U.S. Mexico, U.S. Canada, and the end of a 3-way deal? Do you think that that's a possibility?
I think there's a lot of American interests that are looking for that, including in the White House. Bilateralism works better for the Americans from a leverage point of view. I think we can't be religious about things anymore. The world has changed, like Tim said. I think we need to consider all options. But I think what's important is that we don't concede them before they start.
Yeah, I mean, I get asked that question a lot. I thought we had a free trade agreement. How can these tariffs possibly apply? We have a free trade agreement. And to your point, Flavio, the free trade agreement is still there. It's like it's idling, it's in neutral and it's idling. And all these tariffs that you're talking about, the IEPA and the Trade Act tariffs, are just stacking on top of that number of 0.
Yeah.
And that's where we are now. So I'm just looking at time. We've got about 3 minutes left. So Tim, I'll turn it to you for any sort of last thoughts that you have, and then Flavio, I'll give you one chance to also give your last thoughts.
I think if I could underline anything, it's all of we need to do something. Okay, we can't sit back and do nothing now. And I'll bring that back to, it could be configuring, it could be planning. It doesn't necessarily mean that I need to go and move my production or anything like that. But we need to try and look around the corner. Use your data. Joy, to your point, use external data as well. We have these data tools at our disposal now. Work with your supply chain leadership. They understand uncertainties. Figure out how to get around to get a mirror to look around the corner using your data, and look internally to figure out how you can free up cash, because you're going to need that cash to react when it's time to react. So that really would be my leaving comment to any clients that I talk to.
Thanks, Tim. And Flavio, any last thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Creative thinking is important. We're having a discussion today publicly in the press, literally today, and with both leading parties in automotive to say, look, we buy 2 million cars a year in Canada. We make 2 million cars a year in Canada. We export 80%. We import 80%. If there's a tariff wall in between and it disrupts everything, you can either concede the sector, or you could turn around and say, is there a way to align demand with supply on the inside of that border There's absolutely no way to do it today without losing a whole bunch of money. But if the federal and provincial governments in this country decided that they wanted to reinvest and be invested in this advanced manufacturing sector, then how would you do it? Take a look at that plan. We did it during the pandemic in a very short order period when we were looking for critical PPE and ventilators, and advanced manufacturers were part of that short-term solution. I would say we should fight rather than fly on this one.
So I'd like to thank you, Flavio. Thank you, Tim. A very interesting conversation. Bob, over to you.
Yes, and I found this very, very informative, and I'd like to thank all the panelists and Joy for your moderating the event. So for future information, just go to the CILTNA.com website, and you'll have an opportunity to see about additional webinars. And I'm pleased to announce that on April the 9th, KPMG has invited Flavio and Tim and of course Joy to participate in a KPMG event called the Tariff Through the Eyes of Business. And we'll have some information on how to register for that. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for their participation. Please send us your feedback, and hopefully everybody found this very informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you,
Thank you
Joy.
for having me.
Thank you.